you can imagine a world in sort of 30 years' time in which there's been a sort of absolutely radical transformation of global shipping lanes, supply chains, in response to where it makes sense to produce hydrogen. But again, this feels decadal rather than years, this transition, I think.
Hi, I'm Belden Menkus. Welcome to the Purposeful Strategist, the podcast that shifts the conversation about purpose and strategy from what organizations should do to what business leaders are doing and what they've learned along the way. My guest today is Robin Mortimer, Chief Executive Officer of the Port of London Authority, responsible for the biggest port in the UK. The Authority is a self-funding trust port which generated close to £91 million last year, all of which was reinvested. Robin was one of my first guests on the Purposeful Strategist in 2021. Since then, the PLA has published Thames Vision 2050, which sets out the port's path to net zero emissions and includes ambitious environmental, economic, and recreational goals. 2024 marks Robin's 10th year as CEO, so it seemed like a really good time to check in and see how things are going. Robin, welcome back to the Purposeful Strategist podcast.
Thanks, Belden. Good to see you again.
Likewise. Well, if you don't mind, let me just sort of start things off by asking you if you could just remind us, for those who were here in 21 and tell those who weren't, what's the Port of London Authority's purpose? What's it all about?
Yeah, the purpose is pretty straightforward, really. It's to pass on the port in a better condition to the next generation than we inherited it, which is taken from the government's trust port guidance, which is a great kind of purpose to have in the sense that it focuses us on the long term and this nice idea of passing on this great asset, this fabulous place that we're responsible for, of the tidal Thames, to the next generation in an improved position, gives us a real sort of guiding purpose.
Tidal Thames, I know, means a lot to you, but for those who perhaps aren't so nautical, what is the tidal Thames?
Yeah, very good question. So it's the section of the River Thames which is affected by the tides, which means it's the estuary and the Thames River, as most people would think about it, all the way up to the first lock, which is at Teddington in West London. So all the way between the North Sea and Teddington, which is 95 miles, the tide comes in and out just like it does at the seaside, and that's the tidal Thames bit.
It's not anywhere near like what most of us think of it as.
No, exactly. I think if you're very techie, I think it's actually a tidal estuary, but for most people it's the River Thames. So think, Teddington, Richmond, Kew, Hammersmith, the boat race course, through central London, Westminster, the city, past Greenwich, and then out to where all the major port infrastructure is out in Kent and Essex.
So you talked about passing it on in a better state. It may be an obvious thing, but how does the Thames Vision 2050 help you do that? How does it serve that purpose?
The two of the guiding words, if you like, in our purpose, and then which translates through into the Thames Vision, are protect and improve. Protect relates to the safety of life and the safety of the environment, and the second, improve, is all aspects of improvement, whether that's commercial, growing the port, improving access for communities to the river, and improving the environment. So those are sort of two guiding principles. And then for the vision for 2050, we kind of think about the river in, if you like, sort of three dimensions. We talk about the trading Thames, which is the role the river plays for hosting the UK's biggest port, as you mentioned in your introduction, and for trade of goods on the Thames in the sort of waterways part of the river. Secondly, the destination or the community Thames, in other words, the role of the Thames as a hub for visitors and for local communities. And then the natural Thames, the role the Thames plays as an ecosystem for wildlife, for habitats, and for providing all sorts of environmental goods for London.
That sounds like a rich basket of objectives you're trying to achieve there.
It is.
If I understand it right, the vision took about 2 years to develop. Can you take us through the process? How did it work? Who got involved? How long did it take? Why did it take so long?
Yeah, the process was slightly extended by COVID, really, because we started the evidence gathering really back in 2019. And then in 2020, we kind of put some of the process on hold for obvious reasons. We were going through a period when the port was absolutely essential to keeping the country moving and supplied, and we weren't so focused on the long-term strategy for that period. And then we sort of restarted the work in 2021. It was a very engaged process. We have a lot of stakeholders related to the Thames, whether that's community groups or businesses or environmental organisations. So we really did two things. We pulled together a whole load of evidence, which we commissioned, things like looking at decarbonisation pathway and the future of port trade. And then we pulled together views and ideas from all of our stakeholders. And those two things came together, and then we produced the vision.
So that's kind of what content went into it. But if you showed me some video of people actually developing it, what would I be seeing? How did it actually happen?
It's an interesting question. How do organisations produce documents that set out their direction? It's kind of 90% interactive effort and 10%, somebody usually sitting with a sort of wet towel around their head and pulling it all together. But I think the interactive bit's really important, both in terms of, gathering in views and even the evidence-based side of it. We had Oxford Economics do a great bit of economic analysis for us, but again, the way in which they went about that was interactive in the sense of talking to port customers, talking to those involved in UK economic projections more generally, and then producing a report. We did a lot of talking to our stakeholders and then a lot of internal discussion to kind of gradually shape the document. But yes, I think that sometimes we sort of underestimate a bit the importance of the thought process itself. Somebody, in this case, our sort of director of corporate affairs and myself mainly, had to do some of that final honing of all of that information into a communication.
Yeah, it does seem to me that one of the things that I think you've been grappling with, and that a lot of for-profit businesses are increasingly having to grapple with, is stakeholders who have very conflicting objectives. That if you have customers and they like your product and they pay you a fair price and you make some profit on it, you can give that to the shareholder. So you can see how that aligns. But surely there must be areas where people have different senses of what they want to be able to use the river for. And there's only one bit of tidal estuary in that place. How do you navigate through that?
I suppose there's two ways of looking at it. I think one is where we're trying to seek a kind of compromise position on an issue where there's a kind of a binary choice to be made. So taking the issue of wash from commercial vessels, for example, you say if you're going to have commercial vessels, they're going to have some impact. The issue for us is deciding, can we minimize that impact, for example, by setting a speed limit that reduces, and some might want it to be faster, some slow, and we have to kind of compromise on that. I think the other, perhaps more interesting one, though, is whether you can achieve sort of multiple outcomes at the same time. And I think we've increasingly been trying to do that in some of our sort of approach to land use. So, for example, one of the big issues we have on the Thames is lack of land, or wharves as we call them, for getting goods on and off the river. A lot of the wharves were lost in the housing developments in the 1980s and 90s. So we're absolutely adamant that we should keep the remaining wharves in use. Now, often we're competing with another sort of social good, if you like, which is the provision of housing. But we've in the recent years been able to take a kind of more pragmatic view to look at where we can, for example, consolidate industrial uses in one part of the river, but then free up land which would otherwise be designated for industrial use for housing elsewhere. So you're going to get the best of both worlds. The other option, of course, is mixed use developments where you have a wharf with housing above it, which isn't without its issues, but it allows you to have both things at the same time. So I guess that's where I think it's really interesting to try and find sort of solutions which deliver for multiple stakeholders, going back to your original question, Belden.
Yeah. Yeah. You've touched on a really interesting and obviously sort of fairly topical and therefore political point. But to what extent do you think the model that you're using around the Thames estuary is potentially a model for usage more broadly? Because what I'm taking from what you're saying, Robin, is that there is limited land. That's probably true throughout much of the UK, but particularly in the sorts of areas where everybody wants to live. That's almost the definition of having limited land. And yet you're finding pragmatic, practical ways to achieve multiple stakeholders' outcomes one way or the other. But it sounds to me part of the reason you can do that is you have a set of powers that often local authorities, local governments don't have. Or am I imagining some stuff about the PLA that's sort of not really true?
So in relation to Riverside Wharves, it's usually the London Mayor that's making the final decision, and our role is to act as the expert advisor on planning decisions on the river. But typically the the Greater London Authority, will give considerable weight to our view. I think it's a lot to do with sort of land values and capital cities, actually. So it's this sort of intensification of uses and coming up with quite innovative solutions, whether it's sort of architectural solutions or engineering solutions, is I think partly driven by the land values, which incentivizes people to look for those sort of solutions. I think the sort of intensification of political ideas and consultancy expertise that you get in sort of major cities again enables us to come up with some of these more innovative approaches. So I think probably within the UK context, London is leading on that sort of area, but I certainly see elsewhere in the world some really interesting projects of that sort as well.
Yeah. And how do you see the PLA's role evolving through the development and promulgation of Vision 2050?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. I guess we have a number of different functions, if you like, in relation to sort of delivering the vision. There are some areas where we are very directly the delivery body. So, for example, anybody wanting to bring a ship into port has to have either a PLA pilot on board or has to have exemption given by the PLA. So, the port can't grow without us providing that service. That's a very direct one. Then we have roles with the regulator. So at the moment, London Gateway, which is the biggest terminal in the port, owned by DP World, just opened its fourth berth. It's got consent for 2 more berths, so it's still kind of growing rapidly. And we're the regulator for some aspects of that. So again, that needs us to happen. And then there are areas where I guess we're more playing a role of either sort of advocate or a convener to try and make things happen which are beyond our direct control. So I think a really good example of that is our efforts to decarbonise use of the river. There's decarbonising our own operations. Obviously, that's a very small proportion of the total carbon emissions for the Thames. But we've also got a net zero plan for the wider river and port, where we're mostly acting as a sort of convener and as a facilitator for action for others. So I think it kind of depends what the issue is, but we play all of those roles in various degrees.
And if I recall right, one of the things you were, I won't say concerned about, but this certainly was on your mind when we spoke last in the podcast, was just there wasn't much public awareness of the role of the PLA, the importance of the tidal Thames. Has Vision 2050 begun to change that?
I think it has with some of our key stakeholders. I think certainly we're well on the radar. It's very hard not to avoid sort of metaphors that related to your sector, aren't they? So I talk, we're on the radar for the mayor and for the London authorities. I think for the wider public, then I still think actually both the port and certainly the Port of London Authority are not high profile. I think that's partly because of the geography of the river. So, for most people in London, they're not seeing the major port terminals in the way that other ports may do. So, whereas I was in Barcelona actually last week for a sort of Port Authority round table, which is really interesting. And of course, in the city of Barcelona, just to take one example, you've got 7 cruise ships sitting in the middle of, downtown. You've got major container port. It's very much front and central. So the port of Barcelona is seen very sort of close to the identity of the city. And I think we don't have that in the same way because of the geography.
The geography meaning because the place where most of the big ships go is so far away from the place where most of the people live and work that you just don't see it.
Exactly. I mean, I think our biggest terminals are all in Thurrock. So, in fact, we should in some ways perhaps be called the Port of South Essex, but it doesn't have quite the same ring to it, does it?
No, it doesn't have the same romance.
Exactly. So, so what's in central London now tends to be the sort of inland waterways side of things, which is barges carrying waste and other sort of construction materials, passenger transport, recreation. But people don't tend to think of that as a port in the same way, I think.
Yeah. Yeah. And how have your own employees reacted to Vision 2050? What's the impact in the organization been?
Yeah, really positive. So I meet all our new joiners, as you'd expect. We've got 450 employees, and I always talk to people when they join, and it's surprising how many of them. If I ask people, what attracted you to come work for the PLA, a lot of people will talk about Thames Vision, and apart from being polite to me as the new boss, I think it kind of captures people's imaginations. A lot of people in the marine sector, in particular, are really excited to be working for the biggest port that's also the fastest growing port. It's also very good for job security. We've got increasing demand for pilotage and other sort of river services, so people are joining a growing organisation. Dare I say, a lot of younger people in particular really like the focus on the sort of non-commercial aspects as much as the commercial. So the fact that we're ambitious on cleaning up the river, ambitious on decarbonisation, ambitious on community impact, and being a good sort of citizen. I think those are really attractive features of it for people.
I also think I remember one of the issues, and it sort of touches on what we've just been talking about, was that you kind of wanted to help people make a better connection between the strategy and their individual job at the PLA. How have you been working on that, and how's it been going?
Yeah, I think we've done better with that in the last 2 or 3 years, actually. We've been really focused. I think the concept of the trading Thames, which is in this new vision, goes out to 2050, is a really strong connector for many people. So if you're a pilot in the PLA and you're bringing container ships in or bulk carriers, you're very directly contributing to the trading Thames. If you are working in our marine services department and you are overhauling navigation buoys, again, you need the navigation buoys to mark the channel to bring the ships in safely. So there's a sort of real connection there. So that's really important because it is this kind of golden thread, isn't it, for any organization to try and connect individual activities and individual people's jobs to a greater purpose, which people need, I think, in their working lives.
Sure. I know one of the other things in the conversation was hydrogen,
Hmm.
which I think has, been this agonizing almost, if I could use that word, sort of hope and yet in some ways frustration. Just curious, how you see the hydrogen economy in the ports development and as a way to achieve decarbonization.
Yeah, that's a big question. The first thing I'd say is I think in the long term, it has to be part of the solution, doesn't it, to decarbonise in the maritime sector. Electrification is not going to work for big ships. There's not going to be enough biofuel to be sourced sustainably. So hydrogen in some form is needed. I think the speed of deployment is much slower than might have been anticipated 10 years ago or even 5 years ago. So I mentioned I've just come back from a meeting in Barcelona, which was focused on decarbonisation, and it was really well attended from ports from Asia, North America, Europe, Africa. So it was really interesting to get this sort of global perspective. And actually, I didn't get the sense that anywhere in the world was significantly advanced on the deployment of hydrogen. There's a lot of prototypes. The Port of Yokohama has got a ammonia fueled tug. There's hydrogen fuel cell vessel, but they're all at the sort of prototype stage, not at the sort of being scaled up stage. And I think this is where the big challenge lies. It's not that the technology itself is particularly complicated, but the scaling challenge is enormous, particularly for the production of green hydrogen. The land requirement, for example, for producing green hydrogen from solar energy is absolutely vast. And none of that sort of investment in the production or the supply chain has yet happened. I think there's also quite a big issue around the global and national regulation of the alternative fuels, which again is kind of lagging behind the technology. So I'm not pessimistic about it, but I think you've got to be realistic about the speed of deployment, which is very important for kind of near-term business decisions in the sense that, waiting for hydrogen, I don't think it's going to be the right strategy. We're going to need something in between now and then, whether that's electrification where possible, biofuel, or fuel efficiency for fossil fuels.
Yeah, I mean, that third one clearly has been a big focus for a long time.
Yeah.
If I understand the thing about hydrogen, part of the problem, I'm assuming, so again, you can tell me if I'm just misinformed or naive, is if you've got a big ship and you're taking it from port A to port B, and then maybe on to port C and D, you need to know at every port it goes, if it needs to, it can refuel. And so London could build lots of hydrogen capability to supply ships, but you're not going to have the ships coming in needing it unless lots of other ports around the world also do the same. I mean, is that part of the issue there, or?
Yeah, there's definitely some sort of coordination challenges of that sort, I think. There are a number of alternative fuels being developed. So, whereas at the moment the world's pretty simple in that, everything runs on, heavy diesel of one sort or another. In a world where there's a kind of combination of methanol, ammonia, hydrogen, fuel cells, then that's going to add a lot of complexity to bunkering and supply. Until we're kind of clear which is going to be the winners in the race, then that's a disincentive for investment, right? So I think that's definitely an issue. I think the other thing is that in terms of the sort of the future shape of the global economy is, how this alternative fuel market could reshape regional economies. So, very broadly, it was very interesting. Again, I'm just going back to the meeting I had. We were talking about Western Australia and the vast capacity Western Australia has, not only for iron ore, which it exports about 50% of the world production, but for solar power and therefore the production of hydrogen. Sort of closer to us, Western Sahara, again, huge capacity. And you can imagine a world in sort of 30 years' time in which there's been a sort of absolutely radical transformation of global shipping lanes, supply chains, in response to where it makes sense to produce hydrogen. But again, this feels decadal rather than years, this transition, I think.
Yeah. Well, it seems to me it also requires a certain degree of, I won't even say stability, but quasi-stability, an ability to plan on a decade's basis that both you think politically and economically, where people want to ship things to and from, and the politics around all that is going to be stable enough for people to feel like I can put a fair amount of money into this and somehow get it back. That's a huge, huge challenge.
Yeah.
Changing the subject a little bit, if you think back over the last 3 years or so since you were here, what lessons stand out for you? What have you kind of learned along the way over the last few years as a leader, as a player, kind of on a multi-stakeholder stage, and as a person?
Well, so 3 years ago, we were just emerging from the pandemic, weren't we? Quote I heard, which I quite liked, was that ports globally have gone from being invisible to infamous to important, or being seen as important. It's certainly true that pre-COVID, ports were not at all on the sort of public radar or the political radar. Then we had a period when suddenly, there was a lot of focus on essential services. And then, of course, all the post-COVID supply disruptions, and that's been compounded by the sort of the Red Sea, and lots of complaints about ports. And now, I think this sort of recognition that actually ports are a key part of a growth economy. That's quite an interesting sort of development. Decarbonisation, I think, is looming ever larger as a sort of an urgent requirement. And we're planning to be net zero in the next few years, which is a good milestone, but there's a lot further to go on big ship decarbonisation. So that's front and central for us. Me personally, what have I learned through that period? I think one of the legacies of COVID has actually been a greater kind of focus on well-being, actually, in an organisation. There was a kind of operational requirement to know exactly what impacts COVID was having through that period, so that we could know that we could keep services running, and huge concern over making sure we had safe systems for people to work in and so on. And I think that's had a kind of legacy in thinking about people's well-being, looking after people, and I think that's a very positive legacy from COVID.
Mm-hmm. Anything you might do differently in retrospect?
Do differently. I think the impact, the shock, I guess, post-COVID of the inflation caused by Russia's invasion of Ukraine, that has been so unanticipated. So I think one lesson is never to assume anything. I think there was a sort of an assumption coming out of COVID that we were going to sort of gradually put this behind us. The world would sort of return to, quotes, kind of normal. And I think that new shock straight on the back of COVID was tough, and I think it's certainly had big economic impact on the UK and on the port sector and the PLA. We're going through at the moment our sort of 5-year business plan process, and I think I'm much more alive to the possibility that things go completely differently. You have no idea, and maybe that's pretty common across many business sectors now.
Any advice you might give to other chief execs as they think about purpose and strategy for their own organization?
I guess a more general learning for me has been how important it is to have a really clearly articulated sense of direction and purpose for people in the organization. I think the first time we produced our Thames Vision back in 2016, we were very much focused on the external audience and kind of positioning the PLA with our external stakeholders, and didn't give enough attention to the sort of purpose, the why. And I think this time we have done that better, and I think that's really important. So that would be one sort of lesson I've drawn out of it.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And anything we haven't touched on that you'd like listeners to know?
We haven't talked about governance. I think that it's really important to have a supportive board, isn't it, or whatever your governance is, whether it's a board or a public sector. Making sure that you've got the board, in our case, sort of aligned fully behind your vision is really important. And I think that bit of the process was not absolutely straightforward, in the sense that there were different perspectives around the board as to what the priority should be. But that was a very kind of rich conversation. In fact, some of our most kind of strategic conversations about where we should place the emphasis happened in that sort of board context. So I think that's worth giving real attention to early on. Not seeing differences of view around the board table as a kind of problem to be managed, but as enabling you to have a really kind of challenged, rich conversation.
Yeah, it's a great point. Sometimes you have to have the tough conversations to get to a good place. Is a pretty good one, both around boards, around life, around people you work with, the exec table, whatever. Anything you'd like to ask me?
What have you learned from the sort of series of podcasts that you've done?
Great question. There's just a range of different approaches people take to what they think strategy is, how they go about coming up with it, how they use it, and similarly with purpose. Somebody says to me, our purpose is to make a great product, sell it to great customers, and make a huge whacking fortune out of it. I've got no problem with that. I think that's great. But equally, there are other people for whom profit's just not what it's all about. And for me, being involved in that conversation's to some extent why I do this.
Interesting. I mean, words are interesting, aren't they? Because words have such different connotations, and even as you say, the word purpose can mean completely different things in different contexts. I just as a little aside, I also was lucky enough to go to Port of Vancouver earlier this year, and really interesting just in their context. We were talking about First Nations and how they navigate relationships with First Nations, and I made the mistake of using the word stakeholder in relation to First Nations, which is completely unacceptable, because it sort of implies that these are stakeholders alongside all other stakeholders, as opposed to the original owners of the land, and that it has a different sort of set of rights. We use these words and assume a degree of understanding, but I think they do mean very different things in different contexts, don't they?
Sometimes I think it's really important for people to have a little bit of generosity in their listening.
No, I absolutely agree with that. Yes. We need to be so understanding of different ways of thinking. It's very important.
We could carry on being in deep agreement about lots of different things.
Exactly.
Fantastic to have you back on. I hope you don't mind if I plant the seed for a return engagement at some later date.
Absolutely.
Thank you for joining us.
Okay, thanks, Belden. Bye-bye.
Thank you for joining us for this episode of The Purposeful Strategist. In addition to being available on our website, you can find us on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, and Google Podcasts. If you enjoyed this episode, please do follow us and leave us a 5-star review. It helps others find the podcast. Thanks again, and join us soon for the next episode of the Purposeful Strategist.